Trigger warning. This account includes violence against animals and descriptions that some listeners may find disturbing. If that's something you need to skip, I understand. I started that night like any other keeper. Coffee at my station, the red night lights humming over the monitors, the storm already rolling in when I clocked on at 8. I tell you that first because the beginning matters. Routine is the thing that makes the rest of it believable. I'm not some weekend ghost hunter or a late-night streamer looking for clicks. I'm a zookeeper. By the time I was in my late 20s, I'd been put through enough training and certifications to be boringly practical. I know stalls, shift rotations, how to read a barometer and the exact way a lion's throat vibrates when it stops purring and starts warning. Call me steady, call me overcautious. Either way, the facts of what happened are anchored in procedures and timestamps. That's why I keep repeating them. The storm had started around 6, a line of thunderstorms pushing inland. By 8, the rain was steady and loud. Proper storm sound. Wind against the metal roof, a constant slap at the perimeter gates, thunder rolling like someone shifting furniture upstairs. We go on storm watch whenever the forecast looks like that. Doors checked, generators verified, animals moved off exposed staging areas if needed. JJ was the keeper on my team that night. He's practical to a fault, skeptical, funny in a way that's supposed to crack tension, and the kind of guy who catalogs his jokes so he can reuse the best ones. He's in his early 30s and has worked nights longer than I have. You rely on people like him when the power flickers and you don't want to panic. Bartley was the night supervisor logged somewhere in the back office, the kind of man who prefers to explain things with hand signals in a low voice. He told us twice to treat this as a normal storm and to report any structural issues. He didn't want his phone going off with new emergencies he didn't have to manage. At around 9:30, the perimeter alarm for Sector 7 tripped. The panel lit, a red LED pulsed, and the speakers sent that tinny chime out into the station. Sector 7 covers the savanna enclosures, the bigger animals and the fences that separate them from the woods. It's not the sort of alarm that makes you reach for your keys out of reflex, unless you've learned what those animals can do when fences fail. I grabbed my flashlight and the keys that hooked to everyone's belt, gave JJ a look, and we pushed out into the rain. The rain makes everything smaller and bigger at the same time. It compresses sound but opens the background. Every rustle in the brush is pronounced. Every animal call stretches and bounces off wet air. The red night lights in the keeper stations throw everything in washes of crimson that make shadows feel as solid as people. Around the savanna, the lions were awake. That low rumble that you only hear when they're not relaxed. It was there, but wrong. Caesar, our lead male, stood at the fence with his head lodged in a particular way, eyes locked on the zebra yard. He wasn't roaring or pacing, he was fixed, his whole body a tree trunk in the wind, and a deep rolling vibration moved through his chest when he inhaled. I've been in the den when Caesar says no. He's gentle with the crew, but when he's certain of danger, his whole posture changes. That sound? It wasn't for our benefit. It was a warning. We did the basic checks like a reflex. Walk the patrol line, look for obvious breaches, check the fence posts on the north side where the drift runs toward the woods. There was a section where the top strands had been pulled down about a foot, enough for a medium-sized mammal to push through if it wanted to. The tightness in the wiring had given like someone had sat on it. The fasteners were unbent, not snapped, like something had eased through rather than tearing its way out. We flagged it, and I radioed Bartley, Sector 7 breach, north perimeter, request to secure and call maintenance. He told us to stay clear until they arrived and to keep the animals calm. He also said that if we saw anything alive outside, it should be treated as a wild escape, and the city wildlife team should be notified. That phrasing stuck with me later. If you saw anything alive. And it felt like permission to assume it was a raccoon or a fox. We fell into the motions. Log it, coordinate, wait for support. By the time midnight rolled up my list of routine rounds, the storm had that atonal creak sound where rain hits the concrete and runs in strips. We did a complete barn check. Zebra stalls are just like any other, solid gates, concrete floors, and a feed trough bolted in the corner. Pepper, our oldest mare, had been a rescue that thrived on predictability. She'd been with us 3 years, had a striped pattern that people always pointed out on tours. She was an Instagram favorite, the kind of animal that made volunteers with shaky hands feel like they mattered. Stall 4 was empty. I remember the way my stomach dropped. Missing an animal triggers a specific checklist. Did the gate latch? Are there tracks? Check cameras. We ran the perimeter again, flashlights cutting the rain into beams, prowled the service lanes that run between enclosures and the fence. Then we saw it. In the yard beyond stall 4, out under the broken strands by the tree line. Something stood. It looked like a zebra at first. Patterning, stripes, framing a form that held itself like a mannequin. But from where we stood, it didn't breathe in the way a living animal does. There was an odd geometry to its neck, a stiffness in the limbs as if someone had posed it and left it mid-gesture. It turned its head with a small mechanical motion, and the angle of the motion made me think of someone twisting a doll. JJ and I moved closer to a concrete feed trough, where we could be partially concealed, expecting Pepper to bolt or to turn and almost bump us with that goofy zebra annoyance at people getting too close. It did neither. It cocked its head, and for a heartbeat, I could have sworn it looked at me with a focus that felt wrong. Too human, the kind of direct, assessing gaze you get from a thief counting your pockets. We corralled it back to stall 4 like procedure tells you to do for a misplaced animal. Make slow noises, use the gate to funnel, avoid startling. I don't want to pretend this was all calm and textbook. It was handled in the habit of hundreds of similar nights, but the quiet under our helmets hummed like a live wire. We settled it back in the stall. The feed bell clanged, and Pepper, if that was Pepper, stepped in and lowered its head to the trough the way she always did. When the gate locked behind her, I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. We checked the cameras afterward. Camera 1 shows the yard, camera 2, the gate. The monitor at the keeper station, grainy night vision, green wash, shows a single zebra wandering the yard, head down, nothing sinister. The timestamp read 12:07. To the recording, it had been a normal, sheepish animal that wandered back in like nothing happened. To our eyes, the same sequence had included something that tilted its head with a rigidity no animal should have. This is where the story splits for me, between what the lenses recorded and what the skin feels remembering. I kept the transcript of the footage, and later burned the files to the external drive Bartley insisted we maintain for incidents. He said, "Keep everything in case the city asks." He never asked why we kept replaying the footage on the little monitor behind the office counter. JJ shrugged and said the cameras sometimes miss nuances in the storm. Rain on lenses can create illusions. He's a realist. Cameras are cheap, optics degrade, night vision flattens depth. He's right about that objectively. But I know how Pepper moves. I know the little nervous tick she gets in her ears when a thunder ruptures. That night on my end, I had watched something that moved in ways a living zebra doesn't. The monitor disagreed. After that, I tried to reset the night in my head. We did another round. We tightened the breech, laid a temporary bar across the pulled wire, and put out extra feed in stall 4 to keep her contained in case she was skittish. Around 2 in the morning, JJ offered to take the primate corridor while I kept watch at the savannah. He had to be somewhere near the staff entrance for his rounds, and he wanted to stretch his legs. He left with the kind of banter that's meant to remind you that routine still exists. "If the zoo starts doing interpretive dance, call me." I offered a laugh I didn't feel. He was supposed to be gone 20 minutes. He came back 20 minutes plus a lifetime later, white as a sheet. We were under the red glow of the station lights and the rain had finally mellowed to a persistent hiss. JJ leaned against the console, hands in his pockets, and said, in that slow way people use when something in them is breaking, Did you put on a green sweater tonight?" "What?" I said. I was picturing some lost joke. I hadn't touched a green sweater since I was a kid. Night shift uniform is neutral, blues and khakis. "You," he said. "Down by the primates. 2 minutes ago. You were walking the corridor, like you do, with a paper cup and smiling." He blinked hard, and his face folded into something I'd never seen before. He looked like a man who had just waterlogged the only thing he had left to swear by. You waved at me, and then you opened your hand and showed me that stupid vending machine gift from the Christmas party. The keychain with the fake Mac I won in the gift shop. You waved it and I laughed because you used that same lame joke back in December. I remember the photo in my head, me in the primate corridor, holding some cheap plush macaron keychain from the gift shop. I had been at the holiday party, but I'd left early that year. I had not been on the primate corridor in the last hour. I wasn't wearing a green sweater. I'd left my hoodie at home. I'd been leaning over stall 4 when JJ said he'd see the primates. You're messing with me, I said. I was looking at him, but on the inside the world moved like somebody sliding a card under a locked door. JJ's eyes were bright and watery. He insisted, you smiled. You did that half smile, like you do when someone tells a bad story. You waved that keychain. You even hummed that stupid chorus from the shop's jingle. I laughed because we laugh at absurd things in the middle of the night, but the laugh felt deflated. I left the coffee in the kitchen, I told him. I didn't. I stopped because the sentence wanted to be precise, and it was already late, and the storm had taught me to save energy. We went together to the primate corridor. Hallways smell like disinfectant and bananas in the morning. At night they hold that sterilized quiet that the building wears like a sweater. JJ pointed down the corridor toward the observation platforms. The security cameras there were on the same network as the Savannah monitors. We pulled that feed. The footage showed the corridor empty at 1:58 a.m., then a quick blur as something moved out of frame around a pillar. The tally on the monitor didn't show a handler. It showed a person-sized shape vanish behind a wall and then nothing. The thing JJ had seen, he insisted, had gestured with the keychain and then smiled at him. It smiled like you, he said. Not like you do when you're funny. It smiled like when you're trying not to think of it. There's a little verification trick we use on night shift when one of us sees something the other didn't. It's not official, but it's a human habit. You ask for something trivial that only that person would do, and you wait to see if the other recognizes it as a cue of identity. JJ used ours that night. He mentioned the Christmas party ficus in the staff room and how I'd shoved the keychain into his mug because I swore it made the coffee taste better. He knew something only I did because he had watched me do it. He leaned forward and said, "Tell me the joke you always tell about your mother's lasagna." I told it. I had said it 36 times before. It was stupid and messy and personal. JJ laughed in the same breath he said, "It was you. You said it, you waved at me." His voice trembled like a string you don't want to snap. Only it hadn't been me. After that, the station felt narrower. The monitors were suddenly untrustworthy witnesses. The cameras that had shown Pepper as normal became instruments that massaged the world into a different shape, a shape that no longer matched what our eyes and bodies said had occurred. I began to catalog differences in my head, how animals reacted versus how the machines recorded, the timings that bent if you looked at them too long, the ways personal gestures could be mimicked. We kept working. Bartley called at 3:15 a.m. to check on the breach and to confirm no human intruders were in the yards. He trusted procedure. He trusted us to keep him posted. He said the maintenance crew would be out at first light to repair the pulled wire. He told us to keep logs of every oddity for the report. His voice was flat but not unkind. He likes facts presented cleanly. He did not ask, and I did not volunteer, about how something could look like a person and be in two places in the same hour. The radio doesn't carry disbelief well. It eats nuance. We kept rounds because that's what you do. If you stop, you let fear cascade into everything. At around 4 a.m., I sat in the doorframe of the keeper station watching the Savannah in the dim wash of red. Caesar had moved from his position at the fence and was pacing in a way that told me he was seeking scent. The rumble in his chest had quieted, but his gaze kept stabbing to the northern tree line, as if someone there was trying not to be seen. The sky threatened a pale edge to the clouds. Dawn would be 4 hours away, but there was that insistent pull toward increasing light. I remember thinking that if something had used form to enter the zoo, it had chosen mimicking because mimicry opens doors. It's the simplest trick. Imitate something that is trusted, and the human world lets you in. Which hypothesis is worse? An animal using a dead hide as a disguise, or a person using another person's manner? It's the kind of thought that loops and returns to the word imposter. JJ's voice had flattened. He's a man who believes in tools and locks and lists. When lists fail, he grips at memory. At 4:20, while we were double-checking keys, the speaker above the Savannah station gave a soft ping, and then a different sound, like someone clearing their throat on a child's toy. I say we both heard it because both of us turned our heads so fast, I knew we'd both been listening for something. The night had its noises, wind playing at loose metal, rain occasionally hammering in a gutter. This was not that. It was a high, thin sound that could be mistaken for a bird at the edge of perception if you wanted it to be. JJ swallowed and said, "You feel like sometimes the place is listening back?" I wanted to say no to steady my hands, but the truth was harder. Yeah. We decided to tighten procedures. We locked gates we usually left propped. We fastened extra chains. We noted footprints around the broken strands. Tracks that were ambiguous in the mud. Too big for a raccoon, not quite shaped like a deer. We took them with a grain of salt because mud lies. We took them with caution because animals don't usually leave them in that configuration. Narrow heel strikes between two larger pad-like impressions, like something that had knelt, then stood in an unnatural gait. We did normal things like check the inventory of feed and verify every door's latch. We tried, in the small ways we could, to hold reality together with bolts and paper. But the air tightened with a kind of patient pressure that belongs to things waiting for windows to open. JJ told me his eyes had been playing tricks all night. He kept seeing double forms at the periphery, and then losing them. He blamed the storm, blamed his own caffeine, blamed the fact that we were both still weirdly keyed up. I listed internally all the rational possibilities the way I'd been trained to do. Human intruder, escapee, the town raccoon returning in a bold spree. None of them fit the way the animals watched. None explained the stillness of that figure in the yard earlier, or the smile JJ swore he'd seen. We spoke in halting sentences more than we used to. Routine phrases like "secure the gate" took on the weight of liturgy. "If you see me," JJ said at one point, as if offering itself as a small experiment, "say the thing about the lasagna." "Always a crowd pleaser," I replied too loudly, and he scoffed, but his face didn't relax. The night stretched. The monitors hummed. The lion's rumble threaded under our speech like a distant engine. The breach sat patched and unsatisfying, a temporary band-aid over whatever had slipped through. We filled out incident reports because writing things down feels like making them real. The sheet asks for time, location, observed behavior, and witness statements. I wrote everything the way my handwriting does when pushed, neat until it isn't. The entries looked sober and authoritative on the clipboard, even though my stomach was an open question. At 2 a.m., I had gone to the staff kitchen for more coffee, because the body wants small assurances. Hot liquid, fluorescent light, the clink of a spoon. When I came back, JJ was at the station, eyes hollow, tapping the monitor with the pad of one finger, like he could prod reality into responding. He looked up and said softly, "If this is some prank, that is not funny." I told him I didn't think it was a prank. The thought of someone staging this, of going to the trouble to dismantle and drape a hide or to pose like a person in a zebra suit in the rain, it read like a nightmare of creative cruelty. But the idea of a person or people running this elaborate, dangerous stunt in the middle of a storm didn't make sense either. There were too many moving parts, too much risk of discovery. Yet the object in the yard had been posed too precisely to be simple scavenging. It had the composure of an exhibit. When the night is weird, you start looking for corroboration in the strangest places. I took the security footage, the mud photographs, the entries in the logbook, and I tried to line them up like a timeline. The cameras were the easiest to work with because they gave you numbers. 9:30 p.m., Sector 7 breach. Midnight, Stall 4 empty, and then filled. 1:58 a.m., something exits the primate corridor. 2 a.m., JJ reports the sighting. 4:20, A strange sound at the speaker. When your human memory wants to betray you, numbers feel like an ally. But numbers are indifferent. They do not complain about the smell of wet hide or the way a lion looks at a patch of dirt. There's a small human thing we do when reality gets too brittle. We test identity with small private cues. That verification, the keychain, the lasagna joke, kept coming back to me that night. It anchored what JJ claimed to have seen, a person mimicking the gestures that meant friend. If someone could do that for a laugh, what could they do for more deliberate ends? We walked the line again between 4 and 5, keeping to the low lantern light. Caesar followed our movements vaguely with his bulk, as if he wanted to be present, but not involved. The 3 other lions, Tiberius and the 2 younger females, stayed closer to the den. Their postures were closed and watchful. Animals tell you what's wrong in ways humans rarely appreciate. They show you the direction of attention and sometimes the depth of alarm. That night they watched a place where there was nothing to see but a fence. At about 5 a.m., with dawn still a rumor on the horizon, JJ and I sat on the service bench and let the rain taper to a steady whisper. We spoke small talk until the words diminished into a shared silence. He kept rubbing a hole at the cuff of his jacket, an old nervous habit. We both had the feeling of being staged in a photo where you recognize the background, but not the people. Then, from the far reaches of the savannah, something moved. It was subtle at first, a patch of darker motion threading through the underbrush. We grabbed our flashlights without making a plan because plans are for daylight. The beam hit a shape and the shape broke out and crossed the grass with a motion that was too smooth for a human, too deliberate for a deer. It moved like a thing that had practiced walking in another body. It slid toward the boundary where the tall oaks shadow the fence and then, as if to remind us why we were on that watch, it was gone, slipped into the trees like a seam closed on the night. We assumed for a handful of seconds that it was an escapee running to the woods. That assumption felt safer, because assumptions that reduce complexity make the world habitable. We radioed Bartley and the dispatcher, sighting of something exiting the savannah, heading north. The response was automatic: call maintenance, call city wildlife, secure the fence. Not one of the responses acknowledged the way the thing had moved, the almost human poise of its shoulders, the way its head had turned at the same angle as a person watching their feet. We went to stall 4 again before daylight fully broke because something about proximity makes accountability feel possible. The feed room's monitors showed again the same clean depths. Pepper entering the stall, settling. In person, the stall looked much the same as it always had, down to the frayed rope at the trough edge. We opened the gate like the practice insists, called her name, and she did not come the way she used to. The smell hit me before I processed everything else. A heavy copper under-earth scent that makes your stomach lean backward. It is the smell of something gone very wrong, a sourness in the air that 1,000 nights of sweat and hay cannot mask. I don't want to describe the hide in the fullest way, because there are details that become monstrous when unpacked with textbook exactness. What I will say is this: the hide was there, laid out as if someone had flattened a rug in the middle of the stall. The stripes matched Pepper's pattern enough that you could tell who it had come from. The cut along one edge was long and precise, not the tearing of a corner ripped by an animal in panic, not the sloppy bite marks of a predator. The incision was like an opening. Someone, or something, had removed it with a care that suggested intention rather than animal frenzy. It was displayed that way as if to be seen. JJ vomited into the trough behind me, and I steadied him and myself by leaning against the gate. Bartley arrived with a police officer in the first pale of dawn. The officer took pictures, and Bartley barked orders that flattened into ritual. Don't touch, get gloves, seal the area. Day shift people started trickling in, their faces a mix of professional curiosity and a stunned tenderness you see in people who work with animals. You can tell when grief is institutionalized. The day shift keeps it in a neat box because they return to cages and lessons and kids on bus tours. Their roles give them something practical to do. The detectives were careful. They asked about access points and cameras and possible human suspects. They took our statements and our footage. They asked the same question over and over in different ways. The way interrogators make sure you cannot wiggle out of what you said. When did you last see Pepper alive? Where were you exactly at each timestamp? Who had keys? Bartley said in the low voice he uses when he wants to be quiet and mean it, that we treat it as a predator attack, until evidence suggested otherwise. That gave them something tidy to file. But the hide being laid out the way it was did not look like a simple predator strike. There was an artfulness to the arrangement that made ordinary explanations creak. The precision of the incision looked like a surgeon's hand had been replaced by something that did not think in terms of anatomy, but in terms of display. It was meant to be found, and the finding was an act. They suggested later that a human had done it. Hunting, poachers, a cruel prank. They spoke of forensics, of hair samples, of fibers, and of how predators sometimes exhibit behaviors that are hard to explain. They wanted to anchor it to law and motive. Bartley, with his hands in his pockets and his face unreadable, said what he had to say to keep the institution running. We'll treat this as an animal attack until proven otherwise. But there was a look behind his eyes, a shrink in his jaw, that didn't belong to someone completely at ease with that conclusion. The thing that none of the reports could capture, the thing the cameras denied, was the mimicry. Pepper's stripes would remain visible on that hide, but not the meat that had once animated them. The peculiar stillness had been imitated earlier by a form in the yard. If someone wanted to and could mimic the outer shell of an animal, what else could they mimic? What does it do to a person to be copied? To have someone step into the shape you think is uniquely yours? I keep returning to that question, and I know it is an emotional thread that risks being mistaken for the only one that matters. There are procedural mistakes we made that night. There are security lapses we identified in the report, but there are also instincts, animal behaviors that we cannot document with charts. Caesar's gaze, the way the young female lion flared her whiskers, the odd, high, thin sound over the speaker earlier. Those are the things that let you know this was not simply someone breaking the rules. At sunrise, the zoo was a different place. Light scratches away the easy illusion storm-slick night can create, and with light comes more people, more hands, more ways to rationalize what's in front of them. People put on gloves and masks and called specialists. They photographed and logged and methodically put the hide into evidence bags. The city detectives did their interviews and asked me to remain available. Bartley told me to go home and get some rest. He said that with the sort of inflection that means he didn't want my presence to infect the day shift's rhythms. Get some sleep, he told me. We'll get through this. I slept in the shallow, jagged way of people who are exhausted but not safe to their own dreams. The images in my head fold and refold into themselves. The mannequin zebra in the yard, the camera that lied, JJ shouting about a keychain, the small sound over the speaker. When I closed my eyes, I could smell the hay and the long, copper-tinged air of the stall. I felt the gate cold under my hand. The morning's official statements were tidy. A missing zebra confirmed, a hide found, police investigating. Someone called it an animal attack because that's the category journals use. Some of the staff clung to that label like a life preserver. But there are pieces a label cannot hold. The primate corridor footage still has a missing second that the monitors do not explain. JJ still had that look like someone who had seen his own reflection step away from him and lift a hand in a private gesture. That's where I left part one of the night in my head, at the end of the first day after the breach, with the hide bagged and the papers signed, with the cameras filing their indifferent images in folders, and with the animals watching ground that now felt altered. There were questions. Who could have done this? How had they taken a hide without leaving the kind of traces a predator would? What does it mean when a person's mannerisms can be put on like a jacket and worn in the dark? I didn't have answers. What I had was a feeling in my chest like an old bruise, thick and stubborn and refusing to fade. If you've been with me this far and you want more of this account, if this feels like something you need to parse as much as I did, there's more to tell. But I'll say this plainly before we go on. Whatever name you use for it, poacher, predator, skinwalker, shape-changer, the thing we found that night had a way of moving through the zoo that used what we trusted against us. It used form to ask for our mercy, and used silence to teach us to fear. We went back that afternoon to check the repair on the fence. to stand behind telos of institutional calm and see if the animals had returned to their baseline. They had not. Caesar gave us a look that did not welcome explanation. JJ kept saying small, useless things as if speaking could patch memory, and in the corner of my notebooks I wrote, in ordinary pen. The cameras did not record what we saw. That line, more than anything we filed into stacks of reports or into the police's case number, is the thing I wake up to. It is the hinge upon which everything later unravels. The cameras and the paperwork could hold only so much. The city detectives took their pictures, took measurements, and took our statements with a patience that felt designed to wear you down into coherence. They asked me again, the same way they always ask. Where were you at each timestamp? Who had keys? When did you last see Pepper alive? I answered in the clipped procedural language I'd used in the logs. I gave them times. 8 p.m. clock in, 9:30 p.m. Alarm in Sector 7. Midnight barn check showing stall 4 empty. Then filled 1:58 a.m. primate corridor blip, 2:00 a.m. JJ's first report, 4:20 a.m. The high, thin sound over the speaker, 5:00 a.m. The sighting at the tree line, and first light at roughly 5:30, 6:15 a.m. when the hide was found. In the report, time is a ladder. It's supposed to keep you from tumbling into speculation. It didn't stop the falling. Forensics came in the afternoon with a careful, clinical air. They took swabs and fibers and photographs, and they were thoughtful about what they photographed. Close, objective shots of the incision line, the grain of the hide where it had been folded, impressions in the stall's matting. They called in an external wildlife analyst to confirm species ID. The stripes matched Pepper's pattern closely enough to make answers uncomfortable. But their tests were not dramatic. There was no obvious human DNA in the area samples which, in the sterile sort of way investigators say things, made the poacher hypothesis harder to confirm. Blood pattern analysis suggested the removal had been carried out in an orderly manner. Again, an odd phrase that carried its own weirdness when applied to an animal's body. That phrasing, the removal carried out in an orderly manner, was the sort of thing people in suits use to make you rationalize the horror as a puzzle that can be solved. It read like something that belonged in a lecture slide. It didn't comfort us. Bartley nodded when they told us their initial impressions, but he did not look relieved. He folded his arms and kept his jaw clenched in the way of someone performing stability. Later, in the staff break room when the coffee went cold, I watched him go over the initial notes and then stare out the window long after most people left. He didn't say much. When he did, it was practical. Maintenance schedules, an extra patrol roster for the next 2 weeks, permission to put up temporary barriers and motion detectors. He said, "We treat this as an animal attack until proven otherwise." And the sentence was a brick he set across the spill of our fear. The day shift people held the day together in a way that normal people do, with routines. Tours went on, though quieter and more reverent than usual. Children still asked about zebras and were told in soft voices that Pepper had gone to a place where people would take care of her. Some staff set small bouquets by stall 4, which for me felt like admitting both grief and helplessness in the same breath. The institution wrapped itself in the paperwork that lets a place function after something traumatic. Incident reports, maintenance requests, calls to suppliers. Practical tasks create an illusion of control. Control, in my experience, blunts panic. It does not unmake it. The detectives were methodical. They interviewed us all separately and then in pairs, cross-checking descriptions. They asked Bartley about keys and access logs. They checked who had clocked in where at what time. They asked about potential witnesses, about weekend passers-by, about the likelihood of some sadistic outsider sneaking in during a storm. They wanted motives and suspects, and a story with edges. They left with a promise to follow up, and the kind of steely courtesy that tells you they mean it. But even as the official channels busied themselves, the work of living in the zoo continued. Animals do not pause for detectives. Feeding schedules remained, habitat checks continued, and the lions kept living, their bodies moving on biological feedback loops that no paperwork can stop. Caesar watched us like the hinge of the night still under his gaze. His presence felt accusatory in a soft way. He continued to avoid the northern tree line and would not lie down where he had the night before. That behavior, more than any conversation with a cop or a maintenance request, felt like the primary evidence that the place had been altered in a way that was not purely physical. JJ didn't sleep well after that first day. He kept folding his hands tight and then releasing them, searching for purchase. On his breaks, he would take the same route back through the staff hallways, as if the repetition itself could prove continuity. Over the next week, he was quieter in the way a person is quieter when the pieces they depended on no longer fit. Sometimes he'd laugh quickly at something I said, and the sound would not settle into his face. He began to avoid the primate corridor, not out of superstition so much as nervous calculation. He knew what he'd seen, and it refused to sit inside the architecture of his existing beliefs. We tried to make sense of small anomalies. The primate corridor camera still showed that split second of a figure that slid behind a pillar and disappeared. The footage had been enhanced and re-encoded, and still contained a blankness, as if an instant had been digitally excised. A tiny seam in the video where pixels failed to interpret whatever had passed. That blankness became a sort of living thing for me. Not evidence of the supernatural, not proof of wrongdoing, but a hole in the record that felt as loud as anything the detectives could log. You can show an investigator a hole, and they will call it an artifact. You can tell a friend about the hole, and they will nod sympathetically, but no one could stitch it back together for you and tell you what walked through it. There were minor assaults on normality, things that might be explained if you leaned hard enough toward a rational world. A feed box in the storage room that had been locked all week was found open one morning, and an entire sack of molasses treats had been carefully arranged in a neat pile on the floor, like offerings. Nothing inside suggested tampering beyond careful hands. Nobody had security footage of anyone entering the storage that night. The bag stitching looked old, and the molasses smelled like every morning sugar mix we've used for years. Someone had arranged it with an odd kind of ceremony. Was it an animal rummaging like a mischievous raccoon? The pattern didn't match. Was it a person? No prints, no footprints, only the perfume of intent on the air. The days rather than nights brought more interviews. The police told us they had canvassed the area around the zoo and found no obvious witnesses. They ran license plate checks and found no suspicious activity on the county lot. They checked for recent reports of poaching. They called federal wildlife agencies and cataloged the find under an adaptive file name: possible human involvement, animal remains. The phrase felt like an attempt to bracket the incident within a known taxonomy. And yet, it did not mollify the feeling that none of the recorded categories fit comfortably. We found ourselves arguing not with each other but with the concept of trust. Staff members looked at gate locks in ways that suggested a sudden distrust of inanimate things. We would stand in the keeper station and watch the grainy monitors and wait for some reassurance. The monitors rarely provided it. More than once I watched live camera feeds show an animal grazing calmly, while my hearing told me something at the far end of the field had shifted the hair on my arms. The disagreement between senses and instruments made us suspicious of the mechanics of our environment. Then, over the course of the next fortnight, there were little reappearing gestures, redundant echoes of what had happened. A toy I'd left on my locker bench, a cheap plastic key ring shaped like a macaron that I'd once shoved into JJ's coffee mug as a goof at the holiday party, reappeared on my desk one morning folded under a clean paper towel. I had the only copy of that key ring, and I'd not taken it off my keychain in months. I asked casually at the pod where we left keys and gear, and people shrugged, but their faces tightened. JJ looked at the key ring and said nothing. The gesture of leaving it was small, private, and oddly intimate. Someone had chosen to return it, and the choice felt like a message. On the 15th day after the incident, Bartley called me into his office. He closed the door and sat, and for a moment I thought he might read me the city's latest take, or tell me to return to duty with a fresh sheet of instructions. He said that a local reporter had gotten wind of the story, the hide, the missing zebra, and that she had been calling all morning to ask for interviews. Bartley told me not to speak to the press. He used the sentence as a kind of shelter for both of us. Then he said quietly that the detectives were continuing to work the case, but that their latest lead, someone they suspected of scavenging, had not panned out. "We don't have a name," he said. "We don't have a suspect. We got fibers, we got hair, we got a hole in a video, that's all." He paused, and for the first time since the night he'd barked orders at us in the rain, I saw the human inside his professional shell. He rubbed a hand over his face and said in a small voice, "If you feel like anything else happens, you tell me directly. Don't file it and leave it to the paper trail. I need to know." He delivered the sentence not as command, but as an admission of unease. He was no longer insisting on tidy theories. He was acknowledging that he didn't know how to close the gap either. Weeks became a new normal that smelled faintly of disinfectant and unresolved questions. Pepper's stall remained empty but for the bedding, and the hide, now sealed in evidence bags, was catalogued and removed from public access. We were told that the city would decide on whether to release a statement or not. The zoo as an institution tried to adopt a posture of care. But you cannot take a place's memory back from the animals who witnessed it. Caesar remained watchful for a long time. His caution became a subtle, persistent rumor in the staff's behavior. Extra latches, fewer lone rounds, a string of people preferring to walk in pairs. And the mimicry did not stop entirely. It changed shape. It shifted into smaller things that could be explained away if you wanted them gone. A call came over the station speaker one night. My name in a child's voice, faint and strained, saying, "Let me out, please." It was the kind of sound that makes your lungs freeze for a fraction of a breath. I remember everyone looking up at the same time, because the call had come through the same speakers we'd heard the thin toy throat sound on weeks before. The lion's rumble in the den steadied and then thinned. Caesar looked toward the gate as if expecting someone. We opened the log and traced the source. It was an auxiliary line, a recorded loop from the animal enrichment program. The file showed a pre-recorded clip used for training. The clip had been accidentally routed into the live paging system during an update. The investigators later confirmed it as a technical fault. Technically true, practically hollow. It did not account for the way the voice had mimicked my cadence down to the corners of words I habitually softened. It did not account for the way JJ's face had gone white when he heard it, as if the sound had meaning to him that the log did not. At a staff meeting, someone asked if we were all feeling safe. The question was awkward because it required a personal answer to a collective unease. People shifted. No one spoke up about seeing doubles or about the sense that forms could be borrowed. The tendency was to seek sanctuary and professionalism. We rehearsed emergency procedures, drilled for fence repairs, rewired the old cameras to redundant feeds. The security company installed motion sensors at the line and increased patrols. The sensors gave us numbers again, thresholds and triggers, things with clean up and down. Sensors are a different kind of comfort, but numbers don't smell, and they don't register the way Caesar watched the northern tree line for weeks after the incident with a kind of patient accusation. Months slide fast when a place is busy, and the zoo filled with other things to do. New animals came in, tours resumed, and Pepper's absence became a strand of background sorrow. People learned to tell the story in quiet ways at lunch rather than in the blazing way a week earlier. The detectives eventually filed a report that acknowledged our statements and the physical evidence, but also admitted the limitations of their findings. They recommended increased security and continued surveillance and left a list of open follow-ups. Their public statement, when it arrived, used the language of caution and conservative interpretation, probable predation with unusual post-event handling. It made no mention of odd mimicry or missing seconds in footage. That omission was not an oversight as much as it was a jurisdictional decision. Official narratives aim for what can be prosecuted or explained. I am not a conspiracist. I am someone who spends my days with animals and my nights cataloging small certainties into checklists. But there are things checklists cannot hold. There are motions that do not belong to any taxonomy. I still find myself sometimes rehearsing the way that zebra-shaped figure tilted its head in the yard like a question. I imagine the situation and my chest tightens into the physical memory of that wrongness. The mechanical turn, the too direct gaze, the sense of being appraised the way you appraise a coat. Is this the right fit? and then being set down. A few staff left after that season, some for other jobs, some because they said the nights had become heavy. JJ lasted longer than I thought he might. He kept coming in, kept doing his rounds, but he was quieter about everything that once made him laugh. One evening toward the end of the summer, he told me, softly and without the old humor, that he had been offered a daytime-only position elsewhere. He said he needed to know he could sleep without the possibility of seeing himself wave and smile across a corridor. I didn't argue. We hugged in the back hallway, and his shoulder was fragile, like someone who had scrubbed themselves raw on an internal friction. It felt like both a release and a loss. If mimicry was the thing that frightened him most, then getting away from the dark's capacity to borrow gestures was a form of protection he could afford. He left in the early fall. I did not leave. Maybe it's pride, maybe it's stubbornness, or the belief that animals need someone steady in storms and in strange times. I kept walking rounds. I kept checking locks. The monitors remained uncooperative witnesses. Sometimes they showed things differently from how I remembered them. Sometimes that hum of memory, the lion's rumble, the night speaker's thin voice, came back and sat under the skin of my day like a second heartbeat. I was careful about what I said to the new keepers. There's a responsibility in not putting a new person on fear-laden shifts. But I did not pretend nothing had happened. You can't tell a story like this without acknowledging loss. Objects returned to me on odd schedules. The macaron keychain appeared again, tucked into the fold of a logbook, then vanished. I once found fresh hoof prints in the clay near where the hide had been displayed. They were too large for any ordinary animal, and too tentative for a human. The detectives logged the prints and then filed them with an addendum. Inconclusive. The university lab that ran some of the fibers reported back with neutral language. Processed hide, matching equid species. The language of academia is careful, and in its carelessness it sometimes sounds like evasion. Their report neither proved nor disproved what we suspected. It simply did what science is supposed to do: limit itself to what it can test and confess what it cannot. Friends and family asked if I was okay. I said the measured thing, that I was tired and still processing, but the truth lived in small ways. I started sleeping with a lamp on sometimes, a childish reassurance against dark corners. I turned lights on in quieter moments, not because I needed them, but because light made weirdness shrink to a manageable scale. I would sit sometimes in the empty keeper station long after sunset, watching monitors and feeling the particular ache of a person who has seen the structural possibility of being copied. The idea lodged in my brain. What does it do to a person to see themselves performed? There is a privacy in your gestures that, when it is imitated, makes you feel like a stranger in your own skin. The community would occasionally offer a flare of interest. Quasi-investigative reporters tried to get interviews. Amateur sleuths speculated online. People on forums labeled it a Skinwalker incident, a shapeshifter, or a criminal stunt. Some comments were cruel and fantastical. Others were surprisingly tender. People who had lost animals in similar ways contacted us and told us their own stories of missing pets and odd finds. We read them with a kind of hungry sorrow. There is a terrible comfort in the knowledge that tragedy is not always solitary. Others hold similar wounds. But there is also the danger of narrative feeding fear. I wanted nothing to do with aggrandizing the horror into something it hadn't proved itself to be. If you believe in the word skinwalker as an explanation, or if you prefer the word poacher or shape changer or lone opportunist, you will find the language that comforts your worldview. For me, the language is less certain. The nights taught me that identity can be replicated in small, agonizing detail. A way of smiling, the habit of waving a keychain, a tone of voice. Those are not mystical facts so much as human vulnerabilities. We are social creatures who trust faces and gestures. This thing, call it what you will, knew that. It used mimicry like a key. What haunts me now are not the detective's reports or the forensic conclusions. It's the private things. It's Caesar's eyes when he looked at the northern tree line for longer than a week as if he still sought an answer. It's JJ's face the night he told me he'd seen me in the primate corridor, the way his voice almost broke. It's the macaron keychain tucked into an improbable place on a day when no one but me knew to look there. It's the blank second in a video file that becomes, in memory, as meaningful as any photograph. Sometimes I imagine a tidy end to the story. A poacher named, arrested, tried, and convicted, the hide traced to an illegal trade, the cameras cleaned and upgraded, and all of us sleeping easy. The imagination is generous in offering closure. Reality, in my experience, prefers ambiguity. The detectives closed a chapter with their report and recommendations. The zoo tightened its security and replaced sensors. Life continued. The school group still came. New staff learned to read Caesar's body language the way old staff did. And new names got used in lullabies at night, when keepers ate their sandwiches in the break room. But there are moments, the kind that land like stones in the pool of memory, where the world goes thin and you can feel the edges of the normal peel away. Once, late at night while I did a routine check on the Savannah lights, I saw someone cross the maintenance road in the far light, the figure throwing its head in a way that made me think for a moment it was my own gait reflected against a stranger's. I raised my light. The figure was gone, vanished, as if the earth had swallowed it. There were no footprints in the damp grass where it had crossed. I logged a report and moved on because that is what the job asks of you, file and proceed. But inside the file I wrote the simplest thing. The night moved like something that had been practiced. People ask me now if I believe the thing was a skinwalker. They want the crispness of belief, because stories with names feel resolved. I answer cautiously. I believe what my senses told me that night. The way animals behaved, the uncanny stillness of that figure in the yard, the convergence of small cues that defied neat explanation. I do not believe we proved any one cause in a way a court would accept. I will not tell you we trapped a supernatural entity and catalogued it. I will tell you what I know, that something used form and silence to move through the zoo, and that using form is the most efficient way to be trusted. The title of this account names the terror in terms that some will hold as metaphor, and some as literal. You can call it the terrifying moment a skinwalker broke into my zoo, and read into it whatever labels help you sleep. For me, the terror is less about an invented label, and more about the way trust can be weaponized by mimicry. How an animal's patterns, a person's mannerisms, a child's voice can be used against a place that trusts those signs. Whether the body that wore the hide was a person with ill intent, an opportunistic predator, or something else entirely, the effect on us was the same. A recalibration of trust, an enduring discomfort where routine once lived. I still go on shifts. I still check the fence lines and log the hours and make sure the feed troughs are bolted and the gates are latched. I still carry the knowledge of procedures like a talisman. But there is a thinness to some nights now, a feeling that shape can be borrowed. I don't like telling new keepers about the feeling because fear breeds fear. Instead, I teach them to notice what the cameras miss. The way an animal tilts its head, when a lion's rumble changes frequency, when a shadow lingers with intent. These are subtle things and they can't be sealed with extra guards or new sensors. They have to be watched with a kind of patient animal attention. I keep returning to one simple question in quieter hours. If something can wear the face or form of what we trust, what else can it take from us? It's not a question I ask to invite panic, but to remind myself of the ethics of care. How much of our world is built on untested trust, and how careful we must be in the ways we let the world in. The paperwork is neat. The police file is closed to the degree it can be. The hide was catalogued and transported. For the public, the headline faded and the zoo returned to its rhythms. For those of us who were there, the night remains a living memory. I don't want to end this with an attempt to pin a mythical taxonomy on something that, in my honest estimation, resists tidy labels. I will say this plainly. If something with the capacity to imitate came through our fences that night, it used the simplest tool available, mimicry. It used our gestures against us. It used a shape to ask for entry. If you have a theory, whether it's a human, a predator, or a thing that copies shapes, I want to hear it. I'm still trying to make sense of it myself, and what helped me most was listening to other people who had seen strange things, and didn't have tidy answers either. Drop your thoughts in the comments, share your own similar experiences if you have them, and if you want to hear more first-hand accounts from people who work nights in places that are sometimes stranger than the daylight lets on, consider subscribing. Thank you for listening and for holding this story with the seriousness its animals deserve.